Paris. January 21st, 1793. It is a cold, foggy morning, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. The Place de la Révolution is packed with 20,000 breathless spectators. They have not come for bread nor for warmth. They have come to see if a god can bleed. On the wooden scaffold stands a man who was once the center of the solar system, Louis XVI, or rather, citizen Louis Capet. Stripped of his velvet, his crown, and his dignity, he looks less like a monarch and more like a confused, overweight man who took a wrong turn in history. He attempts to speak to his people to offer one last declaration of innocence. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," he shouts, but his voice, once the law of the land, is instantly drowned out. General Santerre raises his sword, and a rolling thunder of drums swallows the king's final words. It is the first lesson of the revolution. If you cannot silence the argument, you silence the man. The executioners, the Sanson brothers, work with the efficiency of butchers processing a side of beef. They strap the former king onto the plank. The mechanism is simple, terrifyingly modern, and perfectly democratic. The guillotine does not discriminate between a peasant's neck and a god's anointed throat. There is a heartbeat of silence, a heavy, suffocating pause where the entire history of France seems to hold its breath. Then, a metallic clack, a whoosh of gravity, and a dull, wet thud. The executioner lifts the severed head by the hair, displaying it to the crowd like a grotesque trophy. For a second, the eyes seem to still be blinking, staring out at a city that used to belong to him. Then, the silence shatters. Long live the nation! Long live the Republic! The roar is deafening. People rush forward, dipping handkerchiefs into the warm blood pooling on the wooden boards, desperate for a souvenir of deicide. This moment, this single, violent separation of head from body, is not just the death of a man. It is the violent punctuation mark at the end of a 200-year sentence, the House of Bourbon, a dynasty that began with a warrior king fighting to enter Paris, and ended with a quiet man being carried out of it in a wicker basket. They were the architects of absolute power. They built a stage of gold and mirrors so blindingly bright that they forgot a simple truth. When you elevate yourself so high above humanity, the fall does not just break your bones. It shatters the world. Welcome to the story of the House of Bourbon. The story of how the Sun King built a golden cage and how his descendants got trapped inside it, waiting for the blade to fall. To understand the height from which the Bourbons fell, we must first look at the bloody mud from which they rose. Forget the postcards of the Eiffel Tower or the romantic accordion music. The France of the late 16th century was not a superpower. It was a failed state, a charred graveyard stretching from Calais to Marseille. The ruling dynasty, the House of Valois, was putting on a masterclass in how to go extinct. They were a tragic parade of sickly, neurotic kings who seemed to possess a supernatural talent for dying young and leaving no heirs. Their mother, the formidable Catherine de' Medici, the Black Queen, spent decades juggling political factions like knives, desperately trying to keep the crown on her sons' weak heads. But biology and fanaticism are cruel mistresses. The country was tearing itself apart in the French wars of religion. This was not a polite theological debate over tea and biscuits. It was a civil war of apocalyptic brutality. Catholics and Protestants, or Huguenots, were butchering each other in the streets, in the churches, and in their beds. Neighbors denounced neighbors. The Seine River didn't flow with water, it flowed with corpses. Paris was a fortress of Catholic fanaticism, a city that would sooner burn itself to the ground than see a Protestant sit on the throne. And waiting in the wings, watching this dynastic dumpster fire with hungry eyes, were the Bourbons. They were the distant cousins, the poor relations. They didn't hail from the sophisticated salons of Paris, but from the rugged mountainous kingdom of Navarre in the south, straddling the Pyrenees. To the perfumed courtiers of the Louvre, the Bourbons were essentially country bumpkins. They smelled of garlic, horse sweat, and rebellion. Worse still, they were heretics. They were the champions of the Protestant cause, the leaders of the Huguenot faction. For a Bourbon to dream of the French crown was not ambition, it was blasphemy. It was as if a wolf had decided it didn't just want to eat the sheep, but wanted to be the shepherd. Yet, as the Valois line flickered out like a candle in a hurricane, these rugged mountaineers realized something crucial. The throne of France was empty, and the only thing standing between them and absolute power was their religion, and perhaps a few thousand armed fanatics blocking the gates of Paris. The story of the Bourbons is not a fairy tale, it is a clinical case study in addiction. Their drug of choice was not wine, though they drank plenty of it. It was absolute power. At first, this power was a medicine, a necessary dose to heal a fractured nation. But as the generations passed, the medicine became a poison, a sweet, golden, hallucinogenic poison that convinced them they were not men, but divinities walking the earth. We are about to witness the full, terrifying arc of this tragedy. It begins with Henry IV, the gritty survivor. He was the architect, the man who built the foundation with brick, mortar, and sheer charm. He was the father of the people, the pragmatist who wanted a chicken in every pot and piece in every church. He understood that power was a responsibility. Then we ascend to the blinding zenith with Louis XIV, the Sun King. Under his reign, the poison takes hold. He did not just wear the crown, he fused it to his skull. He declared, "L'État, c'est moi," the state is me. And in doing so, he turned the proud nobility into lapdogs and the country into his personal stage prop. He built Versailles not as a home, but as a temple to himself, locking France inside a mirror where it could see nothing but his reflection. But the sun must set. We will wade through the stagnant, perfumed waters of Louis XV, a king who inherited the universe and died of boredom. He saw the cracks in the dam, he heard the rumbling of the earth, but he simply shrugged and went back to his mistresses, whispering the most chilling prophecy in history, "Après moi, le déluge," after me, the flood. Finally, the floodwaters arrived to drown Louis XVI. The bill for 2 centuries of excess came due on the desk of a man who just wanted to be a locksmith. He paid the debt not with gold, but with his head. This is not just French history. This is the universal cycle of rise, hubris, decay, and collapse. It is the story of how a family won a kingdom, became the state, and then lost their heads. To understand Henry of Navarre, you first have to understand his smell. In the late 16th century, the French court at the Louvre was a place of suffocating perfumes, heavy powders, and rotting teeth masked by rosewater. It was an environment of toxic artificiality. Henry, on the other hand, smelled like a mistake. He reeked of raw garlic, unwashed horse tack, and the sour sweat of a man who had spent days in the saddle. He was a creature of the mountains, a rough-hewn soldier from the tiny kingdom of Navarre, who chewed cloves of garlic like they were candy and drank wine like it was water. To the effeminate silk-wearing courtiers of Paris, Henry was a barbarian. They laughed at his thick Gascon accent. They mocked his rough manners. They didn't realize that while they were busy smelling like flowers, he was busy smelling like a survivor. In August 1572, this mountain wolf walked into the deadliest trap in French history. He came to Paris to marry Marguerite de Valois, the sister of the king. On paper, it was the wedding of the century, a symbolic union designed to heal the wounds between the Catholics and the Protestants. In reality, it was a slaughterhouse with a wedding cake. The atmosphere in Paris was heavy, hot, and poisonous. The city was a stronghold of Catholic fanaticism, and the arrival of thousands of Protestant nobles for the wedding was seen as an invasion. You could cut the tension with a knife. And on the night of August 24th, the feast of St. Bartholomew, the Queen Mother Catherine de' Medici decided to use that knife. The signal was the tolling of the bells from the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, right across from the Louvre. It was a sound that would echo in Henry's nightmares for the rest of his life. At the first chime, the gates of Paris were locked. At the second, the killing began. It was not a battle, it was a liquidation. Catholic death squads, marking their hats with white crosses, moved from house to house. They didn't just kill the Protestant leaders, they butchered them. They threw bodies out of windows, dragged them through the mud, and piled them up like firewood. The slaughter was so efficient and so enthusiastic that the Seine River reportedly turned pink with blood as far downstream as Rouen. Inside the Louvre, the massacre was intimate and terrifying. Henry's friends and closest advisers were dragged from their beds in the royal apartments and hacked to pieces in the hallways. Henry himself was cornered. He was dragged before the king, Charles IX. Charles was a hysterical, mentally unstable young man who was shouting, kill them all, so that not one is left to reproach me." Henry stood there, the garlic-chewing heretic, facing a hysterical king waving a sword. He had two choices. He could be a martyr, die for his Protestant faith, and become a footnote in history, or he could lie. Henry chose to lie. He fell to his knees and begged for his life, promising to convert to Catholicism instantly. It was not a moment of spiritual revelation, it was a moment of supreme tactical brilliance. He realized that a dead prince has no religion, but a live one can always change his mind later. For the next 4 years, Henry was a prisoner in the Louvre. He was a hostage in a velvet cage, surrounded by the very people who had murdered his friends. This is where the Fox of Navarre truly earned his name. A lesser man would have plotted revenge and gotten himself executed. Henry did the opposite. He played the fool. He acted the part of the harmless, hedonistic country bumpkin. He spent his days hunting and his nights jumping into the beds of court ladies. He laughed at the insults. He let them believe he was shallow, stupid, and easily controlled. He made himself invisible by becoming a joke. He knew that in the court of Valois, people feared the ambitious, but they ignored the idiots. While he was pretending to chase skirts, he was secretly building a network of spies. While he was eating garlic and telling dirty jokes, he was watching the Valois dynasty slowly rot from the inside, waiting for the exact moment the cage door would be left unlocked. He was not just a survivor, he was a predator, playing dead. By 1589, the last Valois king was dead, stabbed in the gut by a monk. By the laws of succession, Henry of Navarre was now Henry IV, King of France. But a title is just a word if you don't have a chair to sit on, and Henry did not have the chair. He controlled the countryside, the rivers, and the open fields where his cavalry could maneuver. But he did not control Paris. The capital was the heart of the kingdom, and it had locked its arteries tight. Paris was under the control of the Catholic League, a radical faction funded by Spanish gold and fueled by religious hysteria. To them, Henry was not a king, he was the Antichrist. They believed that allowing a Protestant to sit on the throne would literally damn the soul of every French citizen to hell. So Henry did what kings do. He besieged the city. The siege of Paris in 1590 was a descent into madness. Henry cut off the food supplies, waiting for hunger to break the city's spirit. But he underestimated the fanaticism of the Parisians. The priests in the city preached that starvation was a holy martyrdom. As the weeks turned into months, the city began to eat itself. First, they ate the horses, then the donkeys and the mules, then they hunted the stray cats and the rats in the sewers. When those were gone, they boiled the leather of their shoes and belts. In a moment of gruesome ingenuity, the starving citizens went into the cemeteries, dug up the bones of their ancestors, ground them into a fine white powder, and baked it into what they called Madame de Montpensier's bread. They were literally eating the dead to defy the living king. 13,000 people died of hunger. They chose cannibalism over a Protestant monarch. Henry watched this horror from the hills of Montmartre. He was a soldier, yes, but he was not a butcher. He realized that he could conquer Paris, but the price would be a city of ghosts. He could blast his way in with cannons, but he would rule over a graveyard. He realized a profound truth that eluded his predecessors. You cannot kill an idea with a sword. The walls of Paris were made of stone, but the barrier keeping him out was made of faith. Henry needed a key, not a battering ram, and that key was cynicism. He looked at the spires of the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, the burial place of kings, and he made a cold, calculated business decision. He would trade his soul for the crown. He famously, or apocryphally, remarked, "Paris is worth a mass." Whether he said the exact words is irrelevant. His actions screamed them. It was the ultimate pragmatic transaction. He treated God like a vendor in a marketplace. On July 25, 1593, the stage was set at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. Henry arrived not in armor, but in white satin, the color of purity, a costume chosen with the precision of a theater director. Thousands watched as the heretic knelt before the Archbishop of Bourges. The dialogue was scripted. "Who are you?" the Archbishop asked. "The king," Henry replied. "What do you want?" "To be received into the bosom of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman Church." With that, he confessed his errors. He recited the prayers, he ate the wafer. And just like that, the barrier vanished. It was a performance. The Pope knew it was fake. The hardline Catholics knew it was fake. Henry almost certainly knew it was fake. He later wrote to his mistress complaining that the ceremony was boring and smelled of old incense, but the people of Paris? They didn't care if it was fake, they only cared that it was sufficient. It gave them the excuse they needed to open the gates without losing their souls. They could finally stop eating bone bread and start eating baguettes. When Henry finally entered Paris in March 1594, he didn't ride in as a conqueror sacking a city. He rode in with a smile, tipping his hat to the ladies while his wagons distributed food to the crowd. He didn't execute the leaders of the Catholic League, he bought them. He paid millions of livres in bribes to the warlords to lay down their weapons. When his advisers complained about the cost, Henry shrugged and said, "It is cheaper to pay them than to fight them." This was the genius of Henry IV. He replaced the fanaticism of the 16th century with the corruption of the 17th. He taught France that peace wasn't found in theological purity, but in political flexibility. He showed them that sometimes the only way to win a war is to stop fighting and start dealing. In April 1598, in the western port city of Nantes, Henry IV dipped his quill into ink and signed a document that was arguably more dangerous than any sword he had ever wielded, the Edict of Nantes. History textbooks often sanitize this moment, presenting it as a glorious triumph of human rights and religious tolerance. That is a lie. The Edict of Nantes was not a celebration of brotherhood, it was an admission of exhaustion. Imagine two neighbors who have spent 30 years trying to burn down each other's houses. Eventually they realize they have run out of matches and their children are dead. They agree to stop the arson, not because they like each other, but because they are too tired to continue. That was the Edict of Nantes. It was a ceasefire signed in the blood of 3 million Frenchmen. For the Catholic majority, this document was a bitter pill to swallow. It legalized the existence of a cancer within the body of the Church. For the Protestant minority, the Huguenots, it was a golden cage. Henry granted them freedom of conscience, yes, but he also gave them something far more tangible and dangerous, military power. The edict allowed the Protestants to maintain fortified towns, complete with their own garrisons and ammunition stockpiles. It created a state within a state. Henry had essentially told a minority group, "You don't have to trust me. Here are the keys to 100 fortresses just in case I change my mind." It was a ticking time bomb of political instability, one that would eventually explode in the face of his grandson, but for now, the ticking sound was quiet enough to be mistaken for peace. With the theologians temporarily silenced, Henry turned his attention to a far more terrifying enemy, the French economy, or rather, the lack of one. The royal treasury was not just empty, it was a black hole of debt, corruption, and rats. To fix this mess, Henry did not hire a charming courtier. He hired a human calculator with a heart of stone, Maximilien de Bethune, the Duke of Sully. Sully was a man who seemed allergic to fun. He was a devout Protestant who hated luxury, despised fashion, and looked at a bag of gold with the same romantic intensity that other men looked at their mistresses. While Henry was the charismatic face of the franchise, shaking hands and kissing babies, Sully was the ruthless operator in the back room, breaking fingers to balance the books. Sully's economic philosophy was simple and earthy. He famously declared that tilling the soil and pasturing the cattle are the two breasts of France. He had zero interest in the flashy new trends of colonization or silk manufacturing. He believed that France's power lay in its dirt. He waged war on the corrupt tax collectors who were skimming off the top, recovering millions of livres that had vanished into private pockets. He drained swamps to create farmland and ordered the planting of thousands of elm trees along the roadsides to provide shade for marching troops and future timber for the navy. If you drive through the French countryside today and see majestic old trees lining the road, you are looking at Sully's ghosts. But the true genius of this partnership lay in how they sold this austerity to the public. They didn't talk about GDP or inflation rates, they talked about dinner. Henry understood the primal language of the belly. He famously proclaimed, "I want there to be no peasant in my realm so poor that he will not have a chicken in his pot on Sunday." Analyze that sentence. It is specific, it is tangible. It is not a vague promise of greatness, it is a promise of poultry. A chicken in the pot meant that a peasant had enough grain to feed the bird, enough firewood to boil the water, and enough leisure time on a Sunday to cook it. It was the birth of the social contract. Before Henry, a king was a distant figure who demanded taxes and blood. Henry was the first to suggest that the king actually owed something to the peasant. Of course, the reality was grimmer. Many pots remained empty and taxes were still crushing. But the psychological shift was seismic. For the first time, the French monarchy was not just a symbol of divine right, it was a guarantor of public welfare. Henry and Sully didn't just rebuild the walls of France, they rebuilt the trust between the ruler and the ruled. They proved that a Protestant survivor and a grumpy accountant could run the country better than centuries of true Catholic kings. By the spring of 1610, Henry IV was 56 years old. He was the most powerful man in Europe, but he was haunted. He had survived 18 assassination attempts. 18 times blades had missed, pistols had misfired, or poisons had been detected. He had begun to believe he was divinely protected, or perhaps he simply knew that his luck was a finite resource that was rapidly running dry. He told his courtiers, "You do not know me now, but you shall die when I am gone." On the afternoon of May 14th, the weather in Paris was stiflingly hot. The king was restless. He decided to visit his old friend and grumpy accountant, the Duke of Sully, who was ill. Against the advice of his guards, Henry dismissed his military escort. He wanted to travel light, to be close to his beloved people. He climbed into an open carriage with a few noblemen and set off through the winding, narrow streets of Paris. Destiny, however, was waiting for him on the Rue de la Ferronnerie, the street of the iron workers. It was a narrow choke point in the city's medieval arteries. As the royal carriage turned into the street, it ground to a halt. The path was blocked by 2 carts, one carrying hay, the other carrying wine. It was the most mundane, trivial nuisance in urban life, a traffic jam. While the drivers shouted and whipped their horses trying to clear the blockage, a shadow emerged from the doorway of a nearby shop. His name was François Ravaillac. Ravaillac was a giant of a man with flaming red hair and a mind fractured by religious fanaticism. He was a failed schoolmaster, a failed monk, and a man who heard voices telling him that Henry was the Antichrist because he had not forcibly converted the Huguenots. Ravaillac had been stalking the king for weeks, clutching a stolen kitchen knife wrapped in a rag. He had tried to speak to the king to warn him, but had been ignored. Now the universe had parked the king right in front of him. Seizing the moment, Ravaillac stepped up to the stalled carriage. The king's window was open, the leather curtains drawn back to let in the air. Ravaillac placed one foot on the spokes of the carriage wheel for leverage, leaned into the cabin, and plunged the knife into the king's chest. The king cried out, "I am wounded!" But before anyone could react, Ravaillac struck again. The second blow was surgical in its precision, severing the aorta and piercing the lung. Blood filled the king's mouth. He slumped onto the shoulder of the Duke of Montbazon. The survivor, the man who had dodged bullets in a dozen battles and escaped the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, was killed by a lone lunatic while stuck in traffic behind a hay wagon. The aftermath was immediate chaos. Ravaillac didn't try to run. He stood there, knife in hand, waiting to be arrested, convinced he had done God's work. He would later be tortured to death in a manner so horrific it makes modern horror movies look like cartoons. But the damage was done. The irony of Henry's death is suffocating. He was the people's king, the man who wanted to feed them, the man who walked among them without fear. And yet it was that very accessibility that killed him. If he had been a tyrant like his grandson Louis XIV would be, locked away in a gilded fortress, he might have lived another 20 years. In death, Henry IV was instantly canonized by the public. The good King Henry, le bon roi Henri, became a legend. People forgot his numerous mistresses, his erratic taxes and his shifting religion. They only remembered the chicken in the pot and the peace he brought. But history has a cruel sense of humor. The knife that stopped Henry's heart also cut the thread of tolerance. With him gone, the wisdom of compromise died, making way for the absolutism of his son and grandson. The sun was about to rise, but the warmth was gone. When Henry IV bled to death in that carriage on the Rue de la Ferronnerie, he left behind a 9-year-old son, Louis XIII, and a power vacuum the size of a black hole. History often overlooks Louis XIII, sandwiched as he is between his heroic father and his godlike son. He was a gloomy, suspicious hypochondriac man who preferred making jam to making war. But he had one redeeming quality: he knew how to hire good help. Enter Armand Jean du Plessis, better known as Cardinal Richelieu. If Henry IV was the heart of France, Richelieu was its cold, calculating brain. Dressed in blood-red robes, this sickly priest was the true architect of French absolutism. He looked at the chaos of the nobility, the unruly Protestants, and the independent cities, and he decided to flatten them all. Richelieu did not believe in dialogue, he believed in the axe. He tore down the fortified castles of the dukes. He starved the Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle into submission. He created a network of spies that would make the modern CIA look like a neighborhood watch. By the time Richelieu died in 1642, followed closely by the king in 1643, the stage was set. The ground had been leveled, the weeds had been pulled. All that was needed was a sun to shine upon it. But the sun was only 4 years old. Louis XIV ascended the throne as a toddler. Since a 4-year-old cannot rule a nation, though some might argue they would do a better job than modern politicians, power fell to his mother, Anne of Austria, and her lover, the Italian Cardinal Mazarin. France hates a power vacuum, but it hates an Italian accountant even more. The nobility, having been crushed by Richelieu's iron boot, saw their chance to strike back. They launched a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. The name Fronde is significant. It refers to a slingshot, a child's toy used by street urchins to throw mud at carriages. That encapsulates the nature of this rebellion. It was childish, messy, and ultimately futile. But to the young King Louis, it was not a game, it was a trauma that would scar his soul forever. The defining moment of his life, the moment that created the Sun King, happened on a cold night in February 1651. Louis was 12 years old. The mob of Paris, whipped into a frenzy by the rebellious nobles, broke into the Palais Royal. They didn't want to kill the king, they just wanted to make sure he hadn't escaped. They demanded to see him. Imagine the scene. A 12-year-old boy, the anointed king of France, lying in his bed in a darkened room. Outside his door, the roar of thousands of angry voices. The heavy wooden doors burst open. The mob pours in, dirty, smelling of wine and unwashed bodies, carrying torches that cast long, dancing shadows on the silk tapestries. Louis did not cry, he did not scream. He did the only thing he could do to survive. He closed his eyes. He controlled his breathing. He feigned sleep. For hours, the great unwashed of Paris marched past his bed, holding their torches over his face, peering at the sleeping boy. They whispered, they laughed, they pointed. The King of France was on display like a zoo animal, lying there, listening to the heavy boots on his floor, smelling the stench of the rebellion. The boy learned a lesson that no tutor could teach him. He realized that Paris was a beast. He realized that the nobility were wolves in silk clothing. He realized that safety did not come from walls but from control. Absolute, terrifying control. In the darkness of that feigned sleep, the boy died, and the tyrant was born. He vowed that he would never be vulnerable again. He would never let these people touch him again. He would not just rule them, he would break them. He would build a cage so bright and so beautiful that they would beg to be locked inside it. He would take the slingshots out of their hands and replace them with mirrors. The Fronde eventually collapsed, not because of a great battle, but because the nobles were too incompetent to organize a lunch, let alone a government. But the damage was done. Louis never forgave Paris, he never forgave the aristocrats, and most importantly, he never forgot the feeling of being small. The rest of his life, the construction of Versailles, the endless wars, the golden wigs, all of it was just a reaction to that one night of terror. The Sun King was simply a frightened boy who decided to become the center of the universe so that no one could ever cast a shadow over him again. On March 9th, 1661, Cardinal Mazarin died. The godfather of French politics, the man who had pulled the strings of the monarchy for decades, was gone. The court of France collectively exhaled. The vultures immediately began to circle. The high nobles, the princes of the blood, and the ambitious ministers all rubbed their hands together in anticipation. They assumed the young king, now 22 years old, a boy known mostly for his love of ballet and mistresses, would simply appoint a new prime minister to do the heavy lifting. They assumed Louis would go back to dancing while they went back to looting the treasury. The very next morning, Louis summoned his ministers. These were men of immense power, men who had run the country while Louis was busy trying on wigs. They stood there, expecting to hear the name of their new boss. Instead, Louis looked them in the eye and dropped a bombshell that would shatter the political structure of Europe. He said, "Up to this moment I have been pleased to entrust the government of my affairs to the late cardinal. It is now time that I govern them myself. You will assist me with your counsels when I ask for them. I request and order you to seal no orders except by my command, and to sign nothing, not even a passport, without my command." The silence in the room must have been deafening. The king was essentially saying, "The office of the prime minister is abolished. From now on, the prime minister is me." This was the birth of absolutism. It was a radical departure from the feudal past, where kings were merely the first among equals. Louis was declaring that he had no equals. He was not just the head of the government, he was the government. The apocryphal quote attributed to him, "L'État, c'est moi," the state, it is me, might never have been spoken aloud, but it was written in every action he took for the next 54 years. It meant that the king's physical body and the political body of France were one and the same. To disagree with the king was not just political opposition, it was a biological rejection of reality. To enforce this terrifying philosophy, Louis needed a machine. He knew he couldn't trust the old nobility, the men with ancient names and private armies who had terrorized him during the Fronde. So, he did something revolutionary. He fired them. He systematically excluded the great dukes and princes from the royal council. Instead, he hired the middle class. He built a government of commoners. Men of the robe, lawyers, merchants, administrators, men who owed their entire existence to him. His star player was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the son of a draper. Colbert was a workaholic genius, a man who slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of the time trying to calculate how many atoms of gold were in the French treasury. Louis loved men like Colbert because he could control them, he could elevate them to the stars, and he could crush them back into the mud with a single word. A duke is born a duke, but a minister is made by the king. Under Louis, the role of a minister changed from a partner to a high-level secretary. He turned the governance of France into a relentless bureaucratic grind. Louis was the first desk king. He spent 6 to 8 hours a day in council meetings, reading dispatches, signing documents, and obsessing over details. He knew the names of the officers in his army. He knew the cost of the stone being used at Versailles. He knew who was sleeping with whom in the court, but make no mistake, this system had a victim. The first casualty of Louis's absolute power was Nicolas Fouquet, the superintendent of finances. Fouquet was brilliant, wealthy, and dangerously ambitious. He made the fatal mistake of thinking he was bigger than the king. He threw a lavish party at his chateau, Vaux-le-Vicomte, a palace so beautiful it made the king's residence look like a barn. He served gold on gold plates. He displayed his family crest, a squirrel, with the motto, Quo non ascendam? Whither shall I not climb? Louis looked at the squirrel, looked at the gold plates, and decided the squirrel had climbed high enough. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested by D'Artagnan, yes, the musketeer. He was thrown into prison for life. His architects, his gardeners, and his artists were all seized by the king and told to build something even bigger, something that would make Fouquet's house look like a shack. That project would become Versailles. The arrest of Fouquet was a message written in neon lights. There is only one sun in this sky. If you try to shine too bright, you will burn. Louis XIV had successfully centralized the state into his own person. He was the judge, the jury, the general, and the landlord of France. The chaos of the feudal ages was over. The order of the autocrat had begun. To understand the genius and the madness of Louis XIV, one must look at his real estate portfolio. In 1661, Louis turned his back on the Louvre and the Tuileries. He hated Paris. He hated its narrow streets, its rebellious mobs, and its smell of sedition. He wanted a place where he could not just live, but where he could create a new reality. He chose Versailles. At the time, Versailles was nothing but a humble hunting lodge surrounded by a mosquito-infested swamp. It was a desolate, miserable place where birds went to die. His architects told him it was impossible to build there. His treasurer told him it was too expensive. Louis simply smiled and told them to start digging. Over the next 50 years, he poured the equivalent of billions of dollars in the lives of countless workers into that swamp. He diverted rivers to feed his fountains. He imported fully grown trees from the provinces to create instant forests. He bent nature itself to his will. The result was not just a palace, it was a weaponized piece of architecture. The crown jewel of this weapon was the Hall of Mirrors. Imagine walking into this room in the 17th century. At a time when a small mirror was a luxury item costing a fortune, Louis lined a 73-meter hall with 357 massive mirrors. On the opposite wall, 17 arched windows looked out over the gardens. The effect was blinding, literally. When the sun hit those windows, the room exploded with light. At night, thousands of wax candles were lit, their flames reflecting infinitely in the glass, turning the hall into a tunnel of fire. This was a calculated psychological assault. When a foreign ambassador walked down that hall to meet the king, he wasn't just walking through a room, he was walking through the sun itself. By the time he reached the throne, he was dazzled, disoriented, and keenly aware of his own insignificance. But Versailles was not built just to impress foreigners, it was built to trap the French nobility. Remember the Fronde? Remember the wolves who broke into the king's bedroom? Louis had a plan for them. He didn't execute the high nobles, he invited them to move in. He expanded the palace until it could house thousands of people. He turned the fierce, independent warlords of France into roommates. It was the most brilliant political maneuver in history. Louis realized that a nobleman living in his province, counting his own money and commanding his own private army, was dangerous. But a nobleman living at Versailles, drunk on champagne, obsessing over gossip, and begging for a pension, was harmless. Louis created a system of etiquette so complex, so rigid, and so absurd that it occupied every waking moment of the court. He turned his daily routine into a sacred theatre. This was the ritual of the lever and the coucher, the rising and the going to bed. Every morning, the Sun King's day began not with an alarm clock, but with a crowd. A select group of nobles would gather in the king's bedroom to watch him wake up. This was the highest honor in the land. To see the king rub the sleep from his eyes was worth more than a castle in Normandy. The ceremony was a minefield of hierarchy. There were specific ranks for who could hand the king his wig, who could help him pull on his left stocking, and who could help him with the right. The greatest honor of all, the holy grail of the French aristocracy, was the privilege of holding the candlestick while the king changed his shirt. Just pause and think about that. These were men whose grandfathers had led cavalry charges and challenged kings to duels. Now they were fighting each other for the right to hold a candle while a man put on his underwear. Louis had successfully turned the descendants of wolves into domestics. He made them dependent on his smile. A frown from Louis could ruin a family for a generation. If a nobleman wasn't at court, Louis would simply say, "I do not know him," and that man socially ceased to exist. To maintain this control, Louis used another weapon, fashion. He made Versailles the center of the world's style, but he changed the trends constantly. One season it was ribbons, the next it was velvet, then it was red-heeled shoes, which by law only the king and his favorites could wear. To keep up, the nobles had to spend absolute fortunes. They mortgaged their estates, sold their lands, and went deeply into debt just to buy the right clothes to be seen at court. And who did they owe money to? The king. Louis effectively bankrupted his rivals by forcing them to party. It was a gilded cage where the prisoners paid for their own bars. However, if you scratch the gold leaf off the surface of Versailles, you find something much darker and significantly smellier. For all its mirrors and marble, Versailles was a hygienic nightmare. It was a glittering sewer. The palace was built for show, not for comfort. It was freezing cold in the winter. Wine would freeze in the king's glass during dinner. But the real problem was the plumbing. There wasn't any. There were thousands of people living in the palace, but almost no toilets. The staircases, the hallways, and the beautiful gardens often served as open latrines. The smell was described by visitors as a stench to make a crow drop dead from the sky. Imagine the scene. A duchess in a silk gown worth a year's wages for a peasant, dripping in diamonds, her face painted white with lead makeup, holding a scented handkerchief to her nose to block out the smell of human waste wafting from the corner of the ballroom. The courtiers didn't bathe. In the 17th century, water was considered dangerous, a carrier of disease. Instead, they changed their linen shirts several times a day and doused themselves in heavy perfume to mask the body odor. They wore massive powdered wigs, not just for style, but because their heads were shaved to combat lice. Underneath those towering white wigs, half the court was scratching at parasitic infestations. This was the paradox of the Bourbon dynasty. On the surface, it was the pinnacle of civilization, a place of unearthly beauty and refinement. But underneath, it was a filthy, freezing, lice-ridden trap where desperate people defecated in hallways while waiting for a man to nod at them. Louis XIV lived in this bubble for 72 years. He successfully severed the nobility from the people. The nobles no longer lived on their lands. They didn't know their tenants. They didn't care about the harvest. They only cared about the candle, the wig, and the king's smile. Versailles was a magnificent achievement, but it was also a machine that manufactured resentment. By isolating the aristocracy in this golden aquarium, Louis ensured that they would be completely blind to the tidal wave that was slowly forming outside the gates. They were too busy watching the Sun King to notice the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. If Versailles was Louis XIV's love letter to himself, then war was his love letter to France. But like many toxic relationships, this love was incredibly expensive and ended up hurting everyone involved. Louis did not just want to be the Sun King, he wanted to be Mars, the god of war. He looked at the map of Europe and felt personally offended by its borders. He believed in the concept of natural frontiers, the idea that France should extend to the Rhine, the Alps and the Pyrenees. Conveniently, this meant he had to invade all his neighbours. For 50 years, Louis treated Europe like a risk board where he was the only player allowed to roll the dice. He fought 4 major wars: the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. The motives for these wars ranged from the strategic to the petty. He invaded the Spanish Netherlands essentially because his wife's dowry hadn't been paid. It was the most violent debt collection agency in history. He invaded the Dutch Republic simply because he hated them. The Dutch were everything Louis despised. They were Republicans, they were Protestants, and they were rich. To a king who believed he was God's lieutenant, a nation of wealthy cheese merchants who didn't have a king was an insult to the natural order. On the battlefield, Louis was successful. His armies, led by geniuses like Turenne and Vauban, were the best in Europe. He captured Strasbourg, he secured the Franche-Comté, and he fortified the borders with star-shaped citadels that are still masterpieces of military engineering. France grew larger. The hexagon shape we recognize today was largely carved out by Louis's sword. But glory has a price tag, and it is usually paid in blood and gold. By the end of his reign, the wars had ceased to be offensive and became desperate struggles for survival. The War of the Spanish Succession was a disaster that pitted France against virtually the entire combined force of Europe. The French treasury, which Colbert had so carefully filled, was emptied. To pay for the gunpowder, Louis had to melt down the silver furniture at Versailles. The peasantry, already groaning under taxes, began to starve as winter frosts killed the harvest and the army requisitioned their grain. The Sun King's glory was casting a very long, cold shadow over his people. However, the greatest wound Louis inflicted on France was not on the battlefield. It was a self-inflicted gunshot to the head of the French economy. By 1685, Louis was getting old, his libido was fading, and he began to worry about his soul. Influenced by his second wife, the pious Madame de Maintenon, Louis decided he needed to buy a ticket to heaven. The price of admission, he decided, was the elimination of heresy. On October 22, 1685, Louis signed the Edict of Fontainebleau. With a stroke of a pen, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. He tore up his grandfather Henry IV's Great Compromise. Protestantism was now illegal. The one king, one law, one faith equation was finally balanced, but the result was a catastrophe. To enforce this, Louis unleashed the Dragonnades. He sent his dragoons, rough, violent cavalrymen, to live in the homes of Protestant families. They were given license to do anything short of murder to encourage conversion. They beat the men, assaulted the women, drank the wine cellars dry, and banged drums day and night to prevent sleep. It was state-sponsored terrorism in the living room. Louis claimed victory. He was told that millions had converted. In reality, he had triggered one of the greatest refugee crises in early modern history. This is where the brain drain analysis comes in. The Huguenots were not the idle aristocracy, they were the middle class. They were the skilled artisans, the weavers, the watchmakers, the silversmiths, the bankers, and the merchants. They were the economic engine of France. When Louis made their lives a living hell, they didn't just convert, they left. About 200,000 to 400,000 Huguenots fled France. They took their skills, their secrets, and their capital to France's enemies. They went to England, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia. The economic impact was devastating. The French silk industry collapsed because the weavers moved to London's Spitalfields. The banking networks that finance trade moved to Amsterdam. The watchmaking expertise moved to Geneva. Berlin, which was a backwater town, blossomed into a major city thanks to the influx of French refugees. In modern terms, this was the equivalent of Silicon Valley kicking out all its engineers because they didn't go to the right church. Louis XIV had successfully purified France's soul, but he had gutted its wallet. He strengthened his enemies with the very talent that should have built France's future. It was an act of economic suicide committed on the altar of religious vanity. The Sun King shone brighter than ever, but he was shining on a hollow shell. There is a terrible irony in the concept of immortality. Louis XIV spent his entire life trying to become immortal, building monuments of stone and systems of power that would defy time. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. It granted his wish, but in the most twisted way possible. It let him live. It let him live long enough to see everything he loved turn to ash. By the early 18th century, the Sun King was no longer the dashing Apollo dancing in ballets. He was a relic. He was 70 years old in an era when making it to 40 was an achievement. The Palace of Versailles, once a temple of joy, had become a silent, gloomy cathedral. The music had stopped. The mistresses were gone, replaced by priests and doctors. The year 1709 brought the Great Frost. It was a winter so severe that it seemed like a biblical plague. The temperature dropped so low that wine froze in the bottles on the king's table. Outside the gilded gates, birds fell from the sky, frozen solid in mid-flight. The poor of France died in the tens of thousands. They died of cold, they died of hunger, and they died cursing the name of the king who was safe and warm in his palace. The God-given monarch could not even command the weather. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill creeping into the king's heart. The House of Bourbon was struck by a sudden, genetic lightning storm. In the span of just 3 years, death swept through the royal nursery with terrifying efficiency. First, his son, the Grand Dauphin, died of smallpox in 1711. Then, a year later, his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, died of measles. A week later, his grandson's wife died. Then his great-grandson, the Duke of Brittany, died. Imagine the funeral processions, one after another. The old king dressed in violet, the colour of royal mourning, walking behind the coffins of his children and grandchildren. He was supposed to be the ancestor, not the gravedigger. He stood like an ancient oak tree in a forest where all the saplings had been cut down. The line of succession, once secure with dozens of heirs, now hung by a single fragile thread, a sickly 2-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XV, who was saved from the doctors only because his governess locked him in a room and refused to let them bleed him. And then the son began to rot. In August 1715, the king complained of a pain in his leg. His doctors, with the most expensive medical minds in Europe, diagnosed it as sciatica. They prescribed donkey milk and massages. They were wrong. It was gangrene. The most powerful man on earth, the man who declared, "I am the state," was being eaten alive by microscopic bacteria. His leg turned black. The smell in the royal bedchamber became unbearable. No amount of potpourri or expensive perfume could mask the stench of a decomposing god. The courtiers who had once fought for the privilege of holding his candlestick now pressed handkerchiefs to their faces and tried not to vomit. On his deathbed, Louis seemed to wake up from the trance of his own glory. He looked at the chaos he was leaving behind, a treasury with a debt of 2 billion livres, a people starving, a Europe that hated France. The facade of the Sun King crumbled, leaving only a frightened old man full of regret. On August 26th, he summoned his heir, the 5-year-old Louis. The boy was lifted onto the high bed so he could hear the last words of the century. Louis XIV did not speak of glory or divine right. He spoke a confession. He whispered, "My child, do not imitate me in the taste I have had for building, nor in that for war. Try, on the contrary, to be at peace with your neighbors. I have loved war too much. J'ai trop aimé la guerre. I have loved war too much." It was a stunning admission. After 50 years of setting Europe on fire, the arsonist finally admitted that playing with matches was a bad idea, but words, however wise, cannot unspend money or resurrect dead soldiers. On September 1st, 1715, at 8:15 in the morning, the Sun King took his last breath. He had reigned for 72 years, the longest recorded reign of any monarch of a sovereign country in European history. You might expect the nation to weep. You might expect an ocean of tears for the father of the country. You would be wrong. When the news reached Paris, the people did not cry. They held parties. They set up tables in the streets and drank wine. They danced. The funeral procession to Saint-Denis was not a solemn march. It was a carnival of relief. The mob jeered and threw mud at the hearse. They were not burying a hero. They were burying a burden. Louis XIV left behind a France that was culturally supreme but structurally broken. He had built a machine of government that required a genius to operate, and he handed the keys to a 5-year-old orphan. The sun had set, and the long, dark night of the 18th century had begun. When the Sun King finally died in 1715, France did not mourn. It exhaled. For 72 years, the country had been holding its breath, trapped in a corset of rigid etiquette, religious hypocrisy, and endless war. Now the corset was cut. The reaction was not just relief, it was an explosion of hedonism that would make the Roman Empire look like a convent. The new king, Louis XV, was a frail 5-year-old orphan. Power, therefore, fell into the manicured hands of his great-uncle, Philippe, the Duke of Orléans. Philippe was the regent, and he was the absolute antithesis of the Sun King. Where Louis XIV was pious, Philippe was an atheist who read Rabelais during Mass. Where Louis was rigid, Philippe was fluid. And where Louis locked the nobility in Versailles, Philippe immediately packed his bags and moved the government back to Paris. The Regency was the era of the little suppers at the Palais Royal, private parties where the doors were locked, the servants were dismissed so they couldn't gossip, and the most powerful people in France engaged in debauchery that would make a sailor blush. It was an era of wit, libertinism, and style. But while the regent was busy inventing the concept of the roué, a man so immoral he deserves to be broken on the wheel, he had a massive problem to solve. The check for the Sun King's glory had arrived and the bank account was empty. France was bankrupt. The debt was so colossal that the interest payments alone exceeded the total tax revenue. The country was technically insolvent. Enter John Law. John Law was a Scottish economist, a professional gambler, and a man who had fled England after killing a romantic rival in a duel. He was a financial wizard with a silver tongue. He came to the regent with a revolutionary idea. Money is not gold. Money is trust. He proposed replacing the scarce gold coins with paper banknotes, backed not by metal, but by the economic potential of France's colonies. The regent, desperate and open-minded, gave Law the keys to the kingdom. Law established a central bank and the Mississippi Company. He sold shares in this company to the public, promising mountains of gold from the French colony of Louisiana. There was just one small issue. Louisiana was not El Dorado. It was a swamp inhabited by mosquitoes, alligators, and very unhappy indigenous tribes. But facts have never stopped a good financial bubble. Paris went insane. And this was the first true stock market mania in history. The Rue Quincampoix, where the trading took place, became the center of the world. Duchesses sold their diamonds to buy shares. Servants became millionaires overnight. In fact, the word millionaire was invented during this specific crisis to describe the new class of sudden wealth. The frenzy was so intense that a hunchback on the street reportedly made a fortune by renting out his hump as a writing desk for people to sign stock contracts. For a brief, shining moment, France was rich. The debt was paid off with paper money. The economy boomed. John Law was the most popular man in Europe. And then, in 1720, the bubble burst. Some smart investors realized that the paper notes outnumbered the gold in the bank by a ratio of 4-to-1. They tried to cash out. Panic spread like a virus. The shares that were worth 10,000 livres plummeted to nothing. The scenes on the Rue Quincampoix turned from greed to violence. People were trampled to death rushing the bank, clutching worthless paper in their hands. The millionaires were paupers again by lunchtime. John Law, the wizard, had to flee France disguised as a woman to avoid being torn apart by the mob. The Mississippi bubble saved the monarchy from immediate bankruptcy by inflating away the debt, but it destroyed something far more valuable: trust. The French people learned a bitter lesson. The government is a liar and paper money is a scam. This deep-seated paranoia about finance would cripple the French economy for the rest of the century, leaving them unable to modernize their tax system while their rival, Great Britain, surged ahead. The Regency began with a party, but it ended with a hangover that would last until the Revolution. If Louis XIV was the sun that scorched the earth, Louis XV was a beautiful, scented candle burning in a sealed room, slowly sucking up all the oxygen. He is perhaps the most psychological, complex monarch in French history. He began his reign with a nickname that any politician would kill for: le bien-aimé, the beloved. In 1744, when he fell ill in the city of Metz, the entire nation fell to its knees. Prayers were said in every village, candles were lit in every cathedral. The people loved him with a desperate, orphaned intensity. He was their handsome, young hope. But by the time he died 30 years later, he had to be buried at night, in secret, to prevent the mob from spitting on his coffin. How does a man go from being the Messiah to being a pariah? The answer lies in his mind. Louis XV was not stupid. In fact, he was arguably more intelligent than his great-grandfather, but he suffered from a crushing, paralyzing disease of the soul: ennui, boredom. Not the boredom of waiting for a bus, but a deep, existential emptiness. He had inherited absolute power, but he had no desire to use it. He saw the crown not as a divine gift, but as a boring office job that he couldn't quit. He was a man who would rather make coffee. He was actually obsessed with roasting his own coffee beans than make laws. Because the king was mentally absent, a vacuum formed at the heart of Versailles, and in a monarchy, power abhors a vacuum. Into this empty space stepped the women. The reign of Louis XV is often called the reign of the mistresses, but calling them mistresses is a drastic understatement. These women were the unofficial prime ministers of France. First and foremost was Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour. She was a revolution in silk. She was not a noblewoman. She was a member of the bourgeoisie, a middle-class girl who climbed the social ladder using her wit, her charm, and a very strategic carriage ride across the king's hunting path. Pompadour was the godmother of the Rococo. If you look at French art from this period, the soft pastel colours, the floating cherubs, the porcelain shepherds and shepherdesses who look like they've never seen a real sheep in their lives, that is Pompadour's aesthetic. She filled Versailles with curves, flowers, and softness to hide the hard edges of reality. She understood that her job was not just to warm the king's bed, which she actually stopped doing after a few years due to poor health, but to keep him from being bored. She organized theatre productions, she built palaces, she commissioned encyclopedias, and she appointed generals. For 20 years, if you wanted anything done in France, you didn't ask the king, you asked the lady with the towering powdered hair. She was the minister of culture, the minister of propaganda, and the minister of keeping the king distracted, all rolled into one. But when Pompadour died, the king's taste descended from the salon to the gutter. Enter Madame du Barry. If Pompadour was a shock to the system, du Barry was a scandal. She was a commoner with a past that was, to put it politely, professional. She had worked in the high-end brothels of Paris. Introducing her to the court was like bringing a stripper to a church picnic. The old nobility gasped, the king's daughters fainted, but Louis didn't care. Du Barry was beautiful, she was fun, and she didn't talk to him about politics or the starving peasantry. She was the ultimate narcotic for an aging, depressed man. This retreat into the harem had a terrible cost. While the king was playing house with his mistresses in the private apartments of Versailles, the image of the monarchy was rotting. The people of Paris, who were struggling to buy bread, began to hear stories of the Parc aux Cerfs, the deer park. This was a private house where the king allegedly kept a harem of young girls. The rumors were exaggerated by the tabloids of the day, but the damage was real. The king was no longer the father of the nation. He was viewed as a dirty old man, a sexual predator who spent the tax money on diamonds for prostitutes while the children of France went hungry. The visual language of his reign, the Rococo, became a symbol of this disconnect. It was a style of extreme artifice. Everything was covered in gold leaf, seashells, and pink ribbons. It was beautiful, yes, but it was fragile. It was a candy-coated shell over a rotten nut. The aristocracy was dancing in a dream world of pastoral fantasies, pretending to be milkmaids and farmers in satin clothes, while real farmers were eating grass to survive. Louis XV saw it all. He was intelligent enough to know that the system was broken, that the nobility was useless, and that the church was corrupt. But he was too lazy, too sad, and too comfortable to fix it. He chose to close the velvet curtains, light another scented candle, and let the storm gather outside. He turned the absolute monarchy into a private joke, and the people of France stopped laughing long before he died. If the domestic policy of Louis XV was a bedroom farce, his foreign policy was a global tragedy. It began with a move so baffling that historians still scratch their heads. In 1756, France performed the diplomatic revolution. For 200 years, the House of Bourbon and the House of Habsburg, the rulers of Austria, had been mortal enemies. It was the Hatfields and McCoys of Europe. But suddenly, spurred by the whispering of Madame de Pompadour, who was reportedly offended because Frederick the Great of Prussia had named one of his dogs after her, France flipped the table. They abandoned their alliance with Prussia and shook hands with Austria. It was a sentimental decision in a world of cold steel. And it was a fatal mistake. This set the stage for the 7 Years' War. Historians often call it the first true World War. It wasn't just fought in the muddy fields of Germany, it was fought in the humid jungles of India, on the stormy seas of the Atlantic, and in the frozen forests of North America. And in this global contest, France managed to achieve something statistically impressive. They lost everywhere. The war was a humiliation reel. At the Battle of Rossbach, a small Prussian army completely dismantled a French force twice its size. The French generals were so busy packing their silver dinner services and their perfumes that they forgot to pack a strategy. But the real disaster happened overseas. In North America, the French had built a vast empire called New France. It stretched from Quebec down to New Orleans, but Louis and his ministers saw it as a burden. When the British captured Quebec in 1759 and effectively erased the French presence in North America, the reaction at Versailles was a shrug. Voltaire, the great philosopher of the age, dismissed Canada with a line that has haunted French patriots ever since. He called it quelques arpents de neige, a few acres of snow. They traded a continent for a Caribbean sugar island, Guadeloupe, because sugar made money and snow did not. It was a decision made by accountants, not empire builders. Meanwhile, in India, the catastrophe was identical. France had a foothold in the jewel of the East, poised to dominate the spice and textile trade. But through lack of support and naval incompetence, they were kicked out by the British East India Company. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, the map of the world had been redrawn. France was no longer the superpower. Britain was the new Rome, the sun now set on the French Empire, while it was just rising on the British one. The consequences back home were nuclear. The war had cost a fortune. The debt ballooned to levels that were mathematically impossible to repay. But the financial bankruptcy was nothing compared to the moral bankruptcy. The French people looked at their king and they didn't see a conqueror, they saw a loser. And in the 18th century, a loser king was fair game. This was the golden age of the libelles. These were underground pamphlets, the dark web of the 1700s. They were pornographic, vicious, and incredibly popular. Because censorship prevented open political criticism, the opposition attacked the king's body. They flooded Paris with stories detailing the king's sexual impotence, his perversions, and his subservience to his mistresses. They argued that a man who could not rule his own bedroom certainly could not rule the world. They depicted Louis not as the father of the nation, but as a degenerate satyr ruled by the whore Pompadour. This was the moment the sacred magic of the monarchy died. You cannot worship a god once you have seen cartoons of him engaging in orgies while his armies are surrendering. The 7 Years' War didn't just strip France of its colonies, it stripped the king of his dignity. The silence of respect was replaced by the laughter of contempt. And as any dictator knows, laughter is far more dangerous than anger. Anger can be fought with bayonets. Laughter eats through the foundation of the throne like acid. There is a sentence that hangs over the end of Louis XV's reign like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. Après moi, le déluge. After me, the flood. Historians have debated for centuries whether the king actually said it, or if it was his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, trying to cheer him up after a crushing military defeat. But the authorship is irrelevant. The sentiment was the defining philosophy of the French monarchy in its final twilight. It was not a prophecy of doom, it was a shrug of supreme indifference. It was the motto of a man who knew the house was burning down, but decided to finish his champagne because the fire hadn't reached his chair yet. By the 1770s, the disconnect between the court and the country was absolute. While Versailles was obsessing over the height of their wigs, the people of France were obsessing over the price of bread. Rumors began to circulate that the king himself was involved in a conspiracy to starve the poor. They called it the Pacte de Famine, the Famine Pact. People believed that the king was hoarding grain to drive up prices and profit from their hunger. Whether this was true or not didn't matter. The fact that the people believed their king was capable of it showed that the social contract was already dead. In late April 1774, the bill for a lifetime of excess finally arrived. The king fell ill. At first, the doctors thought it was just another bout of melancholy or perhaps a hangover, but then the red spots appeared, smallpox. It was a horrific, humiliating way for the beloved to die. The disease turned the handsome king into a monster. His face swelled beyond recognition. His skin became a crust of black pustules. The smell of rotting flesh was so overpowering that the servants fainted in the hallways. The courtiers, those loyal aristocrats who lived for his favor, fled the palace as fast as their carriages could carry them. They left the dying man alone with his daughters and his priests. On his deathbed, terrified of hell, Louis confessed his sins. He apologized to the nation for the scandal of his private life and the misuse of public funds. But repentance at the edge of the grave is cheap. The people of Paris were not impressed. On May 10, 1774, Louis XV died. The candle finally burned out. What happened next is one of the most disgraceful scenes in the history of royalty. Usually, a king's funeral is a moment of national solemnity, a slow procession of weeping subjects. Not this time. The court was terrified that if they paraded the body through the streets in daylight, the mob would attack the hearse. They were afraid the people would drag the king's corpse out and tear it to pieces. So, they buried him like a criminal. At midnight, a simple hunting coach left Versailles. There were no guards of honor, no musicians, no weeping crowds. Just a carriage rushing through the darkness at full speed, carrying the sealed lead coffin towards the Basilica of Saint-Denis. As the carriage raced past a tavern near Paris, a group of drunkards stumbled out. They recognized the royal livery. Instead of bowing or taking off their hats, one of them cupped his hands around his mouth and screamed the traditional hunting cry used when the fox is spotted and the kill is imminent. "Tie out! Tie out!" Think about that. The King of France, the representative of God on earth, was being carried to his grave to the sound of a hunting cry. The people did not see a dead monarch, they saw a dead pest. They were not mourning, they were celebrating the kill. Louis XV had escaped. He had lived just long enough to die in his bed. He left the throne to his grandson, a shy, awkward 20-year-old boy who had no idea how to run a country. The flood that Louis had predicted was no longer a distant threat. The dam had broken, the water was rising, and the new king, Louis XVI, did not know how to swim. History has a habit of casting villains, but Louis XVI was not a villain. He was something far more tragic for a king. He was a nerd. Imagine a man who was born to be a middle school geography teacher or perhaps a quiet, meticulous engineer, but who was forced by an accident of birth to be the CEO of a collapsing multinational corporation. That was Louis XVI. He was a large, nearsighted, clumsy man who felt physically uncomfortable in his own skin. He hated the pomp of Versailles. He hated the dancing, the gambling, and the endless rituals of the court. His true passion was locks. He spent hours in his private workshop, high above the gilded salons, filing iron, designing complex mechanisms, and creating keys. There is a profound psychological metaphor here. Louis loved locks because they were logical. If a lock was broken, you could find the problem, file a tumbler, oil a spring, and fix it. Locks followed rules. France, unfortunately, did not. He could dismantle a complex security mechanism with his eyes closed, but he couldn't figure out how to dismantle the complex web of debt and privilege that was strangling his kingdom. He was a man trying to fix a broken society with a screwdriver. Standing next to this socially awkward introvert was Marie Antoinette. If Louis was the wrong man for the job, Marie was the wrong woman for the country. Or at least, that is what the tabloids wanted you to believe. Marie Antoinette was an Archduchess of Austria, sent to France at the age of 14 to marry Louis. She was a pawn in a diplomatic game, a child stripped of her Austrian clothes, her friends, and even her dog, and thrown into the shark tank of Versailles. History often remembers her as the woman who said, "Let them eat cake." We need to kill this myth right now. She never said it. That line was an old cliché used by philosophers to mock out-of-touch princesses long before Marie arrived in France. But the fact that people believed she said it tells you everything. She was the perfect scapegoat. She was foreign, she was beautiful, and she was spending money. To escape the suffocating etiquette of the court, where she couldn't even drink a glass of water without 3 duchesses turning it into a ceremony, she retreated into a fantasy world. She built a fake, rustic village, the Hameau de la Reine, where she dressed up as a shepherdess and milked perfumed cows into porcelain buckets. To the starving peasants of France, this wasn't just eccentric. It was an insult. It was poverty cosplay. But the real poison in the heart of the monarchy wasn't the spending. It was the silence in the bedroom. For 7 long years, the marriage of Louis and Marie was unconsummated. 7 years. In a modern context, this is a personal struggle. In an absolute monarchy where the king's body is the state, a limp phallus is a national security crisis. The problem was likely a medical condition called phimosis, a physical painfulness that made intimacy impossible for Louis. But instead of a simple surgery, Louis dithered. He was afraid of the knife. He procrastinated. This delay was catastrophic. The public didn't know about the medical issue, they just saw a king who couldn't perform. And if a king cannot rule his wife in the bedroom, how can he rule the nation? The libelles, the underground pornographic pamphlets, went wild. They depicted the king as impotent and the queen as a sexual deviant, sleeping with everyone from her brother-in-law to horses. This was the first true era of fake news. These pamphlets stripped away the divine aura of the monarchy. They turned Louis into a cuckold and Marie into a monster, the Austrian bitch, who was literally sucking the lifeblood and the gold out of France. Finally, in 1777, Marie's brother, the Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, visited France. He took Louis aside for a man-to-man talk. We don't know exactly what was said, but Joseph essentially told the King of France that he needed to get over his fear of the knife and do his duty. Louis finally had the surgery. The marriage was consummated. Children were born. But it was too late. The damage was done. The image of the royal family had been dragged through the mud for a decade. The people no longer saw a god king and a goddess queen. They saw a fat, incompetent locksmith and a foreign spendthrift. When the revolution finally came, it wasn't just about taxes, it was about contempt. The people didn't just want to change the government, they wanted to punish the people who had made a mockery of it. In 1776, a group of farmers and lawyers across the Atlantic Ocean decided they had had enough of the British King George III. They wrote a document declaring that all men are created equal and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. These were dangerous, radioactive ideas. For a European absolute monarch, these words should have been treated like the plague. But Louis XVI did not see a plague. He saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to stick a knife into the ribs of his old enemy, Great Britain. The humiliation of the 7 Years' War and the loss of Canada still burned in the French psyche. So when Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris, wearing a rustic beaver fur hat and playing the role of the wise, simple philosopher from the woods, the French court fell in love. This is the great paradox of the late 18th century. The aristocracy of Versailles, dripping in diamonds and feudal privilege, cheered for a revolution that was dedicated to destroying privilege. They invited Franklin to their salons. They put his face on snuff boxes. The ladies of the court wore hairstyles inspired by American battles. They were flirting with the very fire that would eventually burn down their own houses. Louis XVI, initially hesitant, was persuaded by his ministers to open the checkbook. And what a checkbook it was! France didn't just send well wishes, they bankrolled the entire American War of Independence. They sent gunpowder, uniforms, ships, and hard cash. Without French money, George Washington's army would have starved and surrendered at Valley Forge. Without the French Navy blockading Chesapeake Bay, the British would never have surrendered at Yorktown. The United States of America owes its existence to the generosity of the House of Bourbon. But the cost of this revenge was astronomical. France spent approximately 1.3 billion livres on the American War. To put that number in perspective, it was enough money to feed and house 7 million French citizens for a year. And where did this money come from? It wasn't lying around in the treasury, it was borrowed. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker who served as finance minister, cooked the books to hide the true extent of the deficit, taking out high-interest loans that would cripple the state for generations. The result was a geopolitical tragedy. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. America was free. Britain was embarrassed, but France gained almost nothing. No new territory, no new trade monopolies, and no cash reparations. They had spent 1 billion livres to buy a piece of paper that said, "Britain lost." It was the most expensive trolling operation in human history, but the financial debt was only half the problem. The other half was the ideological debt. France sent young, idealistic noblemen across the ocean to fight alongside the Americans. The most famous of them was the Marquis de Lafayette. These young men witnessed something incredible. They saw a country run without a king. They saw a society where a man's worth was determined by his talent, not his birth. They heard the words of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine spoken in town halls and taverns. When the war ended, these soldiers didn't leave those ideas in America. They packed them in their luggage and brought them back to France. They returned as heroes, dubbed the Americans, carrying the virus of liberty into the heart of an absolute monarchy. They told stories of a land where freedom wasn't just a philosophical concept discussed in salons, but a political reality. Louis XVI had made a fatal calculation. He thought he was just playing great power politics, weakening a rival. He didn't realize he was delegitimizing his own existence. By supporting a Republican revolution, he publicly admitted that a people had the right to overthrow a bad king. He paid for the gun, he bought the bullets, and he handed the weapon to his own subjects, never suspecting that the barrel would eventually be pointed at him. The American Revolution was the dress rehearsal for the French Revolution, and Louis XVI was the producer who funded the show that would end with his own execution. By the spring of 1789, France was a pressure cooker with the safety valve welded shut. The winter had been apocalyptic. It was so cold that birds froze in the trees and fell to the ground like stones. The harvest had failed. The price of bread had skyrocketed to the point where a loaf cost a peasant 80% of his daily wage. Hunger is a powerful political motivator. You can preach about liberty to a well-fed man and he might listen, but if you preach about bread to a starving man, he will pick up a pitchfork. Desperate and out of options, Louis XVI did the one thing absolute monarchs are never supposed to do. He asked for help. He summoned the Estates General. This was a legislative assembly that hadn't met since 1614. Think about that. It had been 175 years. It was like a modern president deciding to solve a crisis by consulting a rule book written by the Pilgrims. The Estates General was rigged from the start. It was divided into 3 teams. The first estate was the clergy, the churchmen. The second estate was the nobility, the guys with swords and tax exemptions. The third estate was everyone else, lawyers, merchants, peasants, the 98% of the population who actually did the work. The problem was the voting system. Each estate got 1 vote. So the clergy and the nobility would always team up, vote 2-1 against the third estate, and go home to their palaces while the people paid the bill. But in 1789, the third estate refused to play this rigged game. They demanded a head count vote. Louis, terrified of losing control, did what he always did. He hesitated. He locked the doors of the meeting hall, claiming it needed repairs. It was a move of petty bureaucracy that backfired spectacularly. Finding the doors locked, the representatives of the people didn't go home. They went down the street to the only building large enough to hold them, the Royal Tennis Court. There, on a damp indoor court usually reserved for aristocrats to hit balls around, democracy was born. On June 20th, they swore the tennis court oath. They vowed not to separate until they had written a constitution for France. It was a peaceful coup d'etat. They declared themselves the National Assembly. They were no longer subjects asking for favors. They were citizens demanding rights. This was the moment for Louis to be decisive. He could have been Henry IV and embraced the change, or he could have been Louis XIV and crushed it with the army. Instead, he chose to be Louis XVI. He did both, and he did neither. He publicly accepted the National Assembly, smiling and nodding. But privately, he ordered royal troops to surround Paris. Swiss and German mercenaries, soldiers who didn't speak French and wouldn't hesitate to shoot French civilians, began to tighten the noose around the capital. It was the worst possible strategy, enough aggression to terrify the people, but not enough to subdue them. Then, on July 11th, Louis lit the match. He fired Jacques Necker. Necker was the finance minister, but to the people, he was a saint. He was the only man in the government seen as capable of saving the economy and feeding the poor. Firing him was seen as a declaration of war against the people of Paris. The city exploded. Rumors flew that the king's troops were coming to massacre the population. The Parisians knew they needed 2 things to survive: bread and gunpowder. On the morning of July 14th, a mob of nearly 1,000 people marched to the east side of Paris, to a massive stone fortress that loomed over the neighborhood like a rotting tooth: the Bastille. The Bastille was a medieval prison, a symbol of royal tyranny, where kings could lock up their enemies without trial. Ironically, on that specific day, it was almost empty. There were only 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 aristocrat accused of sexual perversion. The mob didn't care about the prisoners, they cared about the basement. Inside the Bastille sat 20,000 pounds of gunpowder. The governor of the Bastille, the Marquis de Launay, was a man out of his depth. He had cannons, he had walls, and he had soldiers. He could have blown the mob to pieces, but he hesitated. He tried to negotiate. He pulled back his cannons. He let the crowd into the outer courtyard. When the drawbridge finally came down, it wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The mob surged in. Delaunay was dragged out, beaten, stabbed and shot. But the crowd wasn't satisfied with just death. They wanted a symbol. A butcher named Desnault took out a pocket knife and sawed off the governor's head. They stuck the head on a pike and paraded it through the streets of Paris. This was the baptism of the revolution. It wasn't ink on a declaration, it was blood on a stick. Meanwhile, at Versailles, 20 kilometers away, Louis XVI had gone hunting. He returned that evening and wrote a single word in his diary to summarize his day. Rien. Nothing. He meant he hadn't shot any deer. He had no idea that he had just lost his kingdom. Later that night, the Duke of La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt woke the king to tell him the news. The fortress had fallen. The governor was dead. Paris was lost. Louis, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, asked a question that has echoed through history. Is it a revolt? The Duke replied with a sentence that marked the end of the old world. No, sire, it is a revolution. For 2 years after the fall of the Bastille, Louis XVI played the role of a constitutional monarch. He lived in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, surrounded by the revolution, smiling for the crowds and wearing the tricolour cockade. He was a prisoner in his own capital, but he was still the king. The people still chanted, "Long live the king," believing that he was on their side, merely held hostage by bad advisers. But in his heart, Louis was seething. He was a devout Catholic, and the revolution had declared war on the church. He was an absolute monarch by blood, and the revolution had turned him into a rubber stamp. Urged on by Marie Antoinette and her lover, Count Fersen, Louis decided to make a break for it. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family disguised themselves. The king dressed as a valet, the queen dressed as a governess. They slipped out of the Tuileries through a secret door. A carriage was waiting. Their plan was to race to the eastern border, join loyalist troops and march back to Paris to crush the revolution. It was a plan that required speed, stealth, and precision. Unfortunately, the royal family had none of these things. The escape was a comedy of errors. The carriage they chose was not a fast, nondescript vehicle. It was a massive, custom-built berlin that looked like a moving palace. It was heavy, slow, and conspicuous. Inside, they packed silver dinner services, wine chests, and enough luggage for a holiday. They treated a life-or-death escape like a leisurely road trip. They stopped for picnics. They got out to stretch their legs. They were hours behind schedule. But the fatal mistake happened in the town of Saint-Menehould. While changing horses, Louis, in a moment of supreme carelessness, put his head out of the window to chat. A local postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet looked at the man in the carriage. He felt a shock of recognition. He pulled a assignat, a paper banknote, from his pocket. He looked at the face printed on the money, and then he looked at the face in the window. The heavy jaw, the distinctive nose. It was the king. Drouet jumped on a horse and rode hard through the forest, beating the slow royal carriage to the next town, Varennes. When the king arrived in Varennes late that night, he found the bridge barricaded. The local militia, alerted by Drouet, surrounded the carriage with muskets and torches. They asked for passports. The king tried to bluff, but it was over. The disguise fell away. The return journey to Paris was the funeral procession of the monarchy. It took 3 days. The carriage moved at a walking pace through a sea of silent, staring people. The men kept their hats on, a deliberate insult. There were no cheers, only a terrifying, dusty silence. This was the psychological turning point of the revolution. Before Varennes, the people thought Louis was a victim. Now they knew he was a liar. He had tried to abandon his people. He had tried to join foreign armies to kill his own subjects. In the eyes of the nation, he was no longer Louis the restorer of liberty. He was a traitor. The idea of a constitutional monarchy died in that carriage. The king had broken the trust, and in politics, broken trust is a capital offence. The trial of Louis XVI was not a court case. It was a ritual sacrifice. In December 1792, the convention stripped the king of his titles. He was no longer Louis, King of France and Navarre. He was simply Citizen Louis Capet. By using his ancestors' surname, they dragged a god down into the mud of humanity. They forced the man who was once the state to stand trial as a common criminal. Legally, the trial was a farce. The king was immune from prosecution under the Constitution of 1791. But Robespierre, the icy architect of the terror, cut through the legal arguments with a terrifying logic. He famously declared, "Louis must die so that the nation may live." It was a binary choice. If the king was innocent, then the revolution was a crime. Therefore, for the revolution to be virtuous, the king had to be guilty. The verdict was written before the trial even began. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, the final act of the tragedy began. Louis woke at 5 in the morning. He dressed with the help of his valet, putting on a brown coat. He took off his wedding ring and gave it to his valet to return to the Queen. It was the only property he had left to bequeath. The carriage ride to the Place de la Révolution lasted 2 hours. It was a funeral procession through a city of fog and silence. 80,000 soldiers lined the streets, their bayonets forming a corridor of steel. Inside the carriage, Louis read the Psalms of David, the prayers of a king abandoned by his God. When the carriage stopped, the executioners, the Sanson brothers, opened the door. They tried to bind Louis's hands. For a brief second, the old Bourbon pride flared up. Louis pushed them back. He was a king. He would not be tied up like a thief. But his priest whispered to him, "Sire, in this last insult, I see only one last resemblance to the God who will be your reward." Louis lowered his hands. "Do what you will," he said. "I will drink the cup to the dregs." He climbed the steep wooden stairs of the scaffold. The crowd was a vast ocean of faces, silent and hungry. Louis walked to the edge of the platform. He was not trembling. In a voice that was surprisingly loud, he shouted to the people, "People, I die innocent. I forgive the authors of my death. I pray to God that the blood you are about to spill will never fall upon France." He wanted to say more. He wanted to explain, but General Santerre, the man in charge of the guard, raised his sword. A roll of drums exploded, drowning out the king's voice. It was the final censorship. The executioners seized him. They strapped him to the plank. The mechanism of the guillotine is terrifyingly efficient. It turns death into an industrial process. The plank, or bascule, tilted forward. The king's neck was thrust into the lunette, the wooden collar. For a fraction of a second, Louis looked down into the basket that was waiting to catch him. Above him, the heavy triangular blade hung like the judgment of history. The lever was pulled. There was a mechanical clatter, a rush of air, and then a heavy, wet thud. It was over. The head of Louis XVI fell into the wicker basket. Charles-Henri Sanson reached in, grabbed the hair, and lifted the dripping head for the crowd to see. "Long live the nation! Long live the Republic!" The shout that went up was not just a cheer, it was a release of tension that had built up for 1,000 years. At that moment, something more than a man died. The concept of the divine right of kings, the idea that a ruler is chosen by God and is answerable only to heaven, was severed. The blood on the platform proved that a king was just a man, made of meat and bone, just like the butcher who watched from the front row. The spell was broken. The House of Bourbon had not just lost a family member, they had lost their divinity. After the head of Louis XVI rolled into the basket, France did not find peace. It found a new master. A short, angry artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte picked up the crown from the gutter and placed it on his own head. For nearly 2 decades, the history of France was the history of one man. The Sun King was replaced by the god of war. But where were the Bourbons during this thunderous epic? They were ghosts haunting the spare bedrooms of European monarchs. The surviving brothers of the dead king, the Count of Provence, who would become Louis XVIII, and the Count of Artois, who would become Charles X, became the world's most pathetic couch surfers. They wandered from Russia to Prussia to England, begging for money, begging for armies, and begging for relevance. While Napoleon was rewriting the map of the world with gunpowder, the Bourbons were rewriting dinner menus in exile. They grew fat, gouty, and bitter. They sat in damp English country houses surrounded by a court of aging aristocrats who still powdered their wigs and pretended it was 1789. They were a zombie monarchy, clinically dead but refusing to lie down, waiting for the winter snows of Russia to freeze the Corsican ogre so they could crawl back into the corpse of their old kingdom. In 1814, the impossible happened. Napoleon fell. The Allied armies of Europe, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain marched into Paris. And in the back of their baggage train, sitting in a carriage that groaned under his weight, was Louis XVIII. The restoration of the Bourbons was not a glorious homecoming. It was an awkward family reunion where everyone pretended the last 25 years hadn't happened. Louis XVIII was 60 years old, morbidly obese, and suffered from gout so severe he could barely walk. He was a stark contrast to the dynamic, energetic Napoleon. But Louis possessed a weapon that Napoleon lacked: cynicism. Louis understood that he was a king in a country that had beheaded his brother. He knew he couldn't turn the clock back to 1661. He couldn't rebuild Versailles and lock the nobility inside, so he compromised. He issued the Charter of 1814, a constitution that kept many of the revolution's changes: the Napoleonic Code, the administrative system, and religious freedom. He was a man trying to sit on a throne that was resting on a volcano. He was the pragmatic ghost, a ruler who just wanted to die in his own bed, preferably after a good dinner. And he succeeded. He reigned for 10 years, balancing the screaming reactionaries who wanted revenge and the simmering liberals who wanted a republic. When he died in 1824, he achieved the rarest feat for a French ruler in the 19th century. He died while still being king. But then came his brother. Charles X was a disaster waiting to happen. If Louis XVIII was the smart brother, Charles was the fanatical one. He had spent the revolution in exile, stewing in hatred. He didn't just want to rule France, he wanted to punish it. Charles looked at the compromise of his brother and spat on it. He wanted the full, unadulterated Ancien Régime. He organized a coronation ceremony at Reims that was so medieval, so full of holy oils and velvet robes, that it looked like a historical reenactment society had taken over the government. He passed the law of indemnity, handing out millions of francs to aristocrats who had lost their lands during the revolution, effectively taxing the poor to pay the rich. He brought back the death penalty for sacrilege. Charles X was living in a hallucination. He genuinely believed that a king could rule by divine right in the age of the steam engine. Talleyrand, the eternal survivor of French politics, watched Charles and delivered the ultimate epitaph for the House of Bourbon. They have learned nothing, and they have forgotten nothing. In July 1830, Charles decided he had had enough of democracy. He issued the July Ordinances dissolving the Parliament and suspending the freedom of the press. He thought he was being Louis XIV. He forgot he was living in Paris. The reaction was instant. The 3 glorious days of July erupted. The people of Paris, veterans of revolution, tore up the cobblestones to build barricades. They threw furniture, pianos, and chamber pots out of windows onto the king's soldiers. The Bourbon army, demoralized and confused, melted away. Charles X was stunned. He looked out of his window and saw the tricolour flag, the flag of the Revolution, flying over Notre Dame. He realized, too late, that the ghost story was over. He abdicated and fled to England, leaving his crown in the dust, the last true Bourbon king to ever sit on the throne of France. When the dust settled on the Revolution of 1830, France looked around for a new leader and found Louis Philippe. He was a Bourbon, yes, but he was from the Orléans branch, the rebellious cousins who had voted for the execution of Louis XVI. If the main line of Bourbons were the dinosaurs, Louis Philippe was the mammal trying to survive in the New World. He branded himself the citizen king. He stripped away the velvet robes and the holy oil. He didn't wear a crown, he wore a top hat. He didn't carry a scepter, he carried a black umbrella. He walked the streets of Paris without guards, shaking hands with shopkeepers and acting like a friendly uncle. He changed his title from King of France to King of the French, a subtle nod to the fact that his boss was the people, not God. But beneath the top hat and the friendly smile lay a soul made of pure accounting ledgers. Louis Philippe didn't care about the aristocracy, but he didn't care about the poor either. He cared about one thing: the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the bankers, the factory owners, the industrialists. His prime minister, François Guizot, summed up the entire philosophy of the reign with 3 words: enrichissez-vous, get rich. And they did. The rich got richer, the railroads were built, and the factories smoked. But the poor got poorer, living in slums that make a Dickens novel look like a travel brochure. When the people complained that they couldn't vote because they didn't own enough property, the government simply replied, well, work harder and get rich, then you can vote. The monarchy of Louis Philippe wasn't cruel. It was just incredibly dull. It was a government run by boring men in grey suits talking about profit margins. The fiery spirit of France, the nation of Napoleon, and Joan of Arc was being suffocated by boredom. The poet Lamartine famously wrote, "France is bored." And in France, boredom is dangerous. In 1848, the government made a fatal mistake. They banned the political banquets, dinners where people gathered to discuss reform because political rallies were illegal. The Parisians, who take both their politics and their dinner very seriously, exploded. The revolution of 1848 was fast and furious. Barricades went up. The National Guard refused to shoot. Louis Philippe, realizing that his umbrella offered no protection against bullets, didn't fight. He didn't want to lose his head like Louis XVI. He abdicated within 24 hours. His exit was the perfect ending to his mediocre reign. He didn't ride off into the sunset in a golden carriage. He disguised himself as an ordinary traveller, calling himself Mr. Smith, and took a public cab to the coast to catch a boat to England. And with that unglamorous cab ride, the House of Bourbon left the stage of French history forever. They had ruled for over 2 centuries. They had built Versailles, they had defined absolute power, and they had sparked the greatest revolution in human history. But in the end, they didn't go out with a bang. They went out with a whimper, replaced by a short-lived republic and yet another Napoleon. The play was finally over. The House of Bourbon is gone. Their bones are dust in the crypt of Saint-Denis. But if you look around the world today, you are still living in the world they built. Whenever you pop a cork of champagne to celebrate a wedding, whenever a diplomat speaks French at the United Nations, whenever a woman puts on a pair of red-soled high heels, you are paying tribute to the ghosts of Versailles. The Bourbons did not just rule France, they branded it. They invented the concept of soft power 3 centuries before the term existed. Louis XIV understood that cannons can conquer a city, but culture conquers the mind. He turned the French lifestyle into the gold standard of civilization. He made the world believe that to be refined, to be elegant, to be someone, you had to be a little bit French. They codified the rules of taste, turning dining, dressing, and conversation into high art. The global luxury industry of the 21st century is essentially a franchise of the Bourbon court, but their legacy casts a long, sharp shadow, one that stretches far beyond silk and perfume. The greatest inheritance the Bourbons left behind was not the Palace of Versailles, but the state itself. Before the Bourbons, France was a patchwork quilt of rebellious provinces, independent dukes, and local laws. It was Henry IV and Louis XIV who stitched it together with iron thread. They crushed the local powers. They centralized every decision, every tax, and every law in Paris. They built a terrifyingly efficient machine of government where the head commands and the body obeys. Here lies the ultimate irony of French history. When the revolutionaries cut off the king's head, they did not smash his machine. They stole it. The French Republic today, with its powerful president and its hyper-centralized administration, is the ungrateful stepchild of the monarchy. The Republic sits in the palaces built by the Bourbons, uses the bureaucracy designed by the Bourbons, and rules from the Paris that the Bourbons made the center of the universe. The Bourbons built the car of the modern state. The revolution simply kicked them out of the driver's seat and took the wheel. The trajectory of the House of Bourbon offers the most perfect and the most painful lesson on the nature of political power. It demonstrates that power is not a static object that you own, it is a relationship that you must nurture. The history of this dynasty is a 3-act tragedy about the widening distance between the ruler and the ruled. In the first act, under Henry IV, the king was the father of the people. The distance was small. Henry smelled like garlic and sweat, just like his subjects. He fought in the mud with them. He understood their hunger. The authority of the crown was rooted in a mutual necessity. The king protected the people, and the people fed the king. It was a contract signed in reality. In the second act, under Louis XIV, the king became the master of the people. The distance became vast. Louis elevated the monarchy to the stars. He replaced the handshake with the bow. He replaced the muddy boots with the red-heeled shoe. He told the people that he was not their father but their son, a distant, burning, celestial body that gave them life but could not be touched. The people obeyed, not out of love, but out of awe. In the final act, under Louis XVI, the king became the enemy of the people. The distance had become an unbridgeable canyon. The silence of Versailles had lasted too long. The people no longer saw a son, they saw a parasite. The awe had turned into resentment. The monarchy had become so detached from the reality of the nation that when they finally tried to speak, they spoke different languages. The king spoke of tradition. The people spoke of bread. The Bourbons forgot that a throne is just a piece of furniture covered in velvet. What makes it a seat of power is the consent of those standing around it. As the great writer and diplomat François-René de Chateaubriand, who served the Bourbons but saw their flaws clearly, observed, "The monarchy is a religion. You do not have it when you no longer believe in it." The Bourbons spent 2 centuries building a magnificent temple, but they forgot to preach to the congregation. and when the believers stop believing, the gods die. The crown of France did not stay in the gutter for long. While the Bourbons were fleeing into the night, a short, ambitious artillery officer with a funny accent was already watching from the shadows. He saw the chaos, he saw the blood, and he smiled. He would not claim to be chosen by God, he would claim to be chosen by destiny. He would take the broken shards of the Bourbon kingdom and forge them into an empire that would terrify the world. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he is coming for Europe. If you want to witness how a little corporal became the Emperor of the French and set the entire continent on fire, make sure you are subscribed to Dynast Saga. Smash that like button as if it were the Bastille Gates, share this video with your fellow conspirators, and ring the notification bell to secure your place in our court. I am your guide through the beautiful wreckage of the past. Until next time, remember, heavy is the head that wears the crown, especially when the guillotine is sharp.